In the dead of night, when most people are safe in their beds, some heroes are made in the most unexpected ways. This is the story of Maria Santos, a 22-year-old Army medic who stood barely 5 feet tall and weighed just 110 pounds. Her fellow soldiers often joked about her size, calling her tiny, and questioning whether she belonged in combat zones. They said she was too weak, too small, too gentle for the harsh realities of war. But on one fateful night in Afghanistan, when 9 armed insurgents surrounded her medical unit, Maria would prove that strength isn't measured in pounds or inches. Armed with nothing but her training, her courage, and an unbreakable will to protect her wounded comrades, she would single-handedly take down every attacker in a fight that lasted less than 10 minutes. This is the true story of how the woman they called too weak became the soldier who saved 17 lives in one night, earning her the Silver Star and changing everything her unit thought they knew about real strength. Sometimes the most powerful warriors come in the smallest packages, and sometimes, when everything is on the line, ordinary people discover they're capable of extraordinary things. What happened that night in the mountains of Afghanistan would be talked about for years to come. But Maria's story begins long before that moment of truth, in a small town where a young girl with big dreams refused to let anyone tell her what she couldn't do. Maria Elena Santos grew up in the dusty streets of El Paso, Texas, where the summer heat could melt asphalt, and dreams often withered before they had a chance to bloom. She was the youngest of 4 children in a family where her father worked double shifts at a construction company, and her mother cleaned office buildings at night to make ends meet. From the very beginning, Maria was different from her siblings. While her brothers played football and her sister focused on beauty pageants, Maria spent her time reading military history books and watching documentaries about famous battles. Her fascination with the military began when she was just 8 years old. Her grandfather, Manuel Santos, had served in World War II as a medic with the 36th Infantry Division. Every Sunday after church, he would sit on the front porch and tell her stories about how he had crawled through battlefields to save wounded soldiers, how he had performed emergency surgery under enemy fire, and how he had never lost a man under his care. These weren't glorified war stories filled with heroics and glory. Instead, they were quiet tales about courage, about putting others before yourself, and about the sacred duty to preserve life even in the midst of death. Mija, her grandfather would say, using his weathered hands to gesture as he spoke, being strong isn't about how hard you can hit someone. It's about how much you can endure for the people who need you most. His words would echo in Maria's mind for years to come, shaping her understanding of what it meant to be truly powerful. At school, Maria faced the same challenges that many small-statured children encounter. She was often overlooked in sports, chosen last for team activities, and occasionally became the target of bullies who saw her size as an invitation for trouble. But Maria had inherited more than just stories from her grandfather. She had inherited his stubborn determination and his refusal to back down when something important was at stake. The first time Maria stood up for herself was in 7th grade. A group of 8th grade boys had been picking on a younger student with disabilities, taking his lunch money and pushing him around during recess. Maria watched this happen for 3 days before she decided she had seen enough. She approached the leader of the group, a boy named Tommy Rodriguez who stood nearly 6 feet tall and weighed twice what she did. "Leave him alone," she said simply, positioning herself between Tommy and his victim. Tommy laughed, looking down at the tiny girl who had dared to challenge him. "What are you going to do about it, midget?" What happened next surprised everyone, including Maria herself. She had been taking karate lessons at a community center for 2 years, partly because her parents wanted her to learn self-defense and partly because she enjoyed the discipline and focus it required. When Tommy reached out to push her aside, Maria's training kicked in automatically. She grabbed his wrist, pivoted her body, and used his own momentum to send him tumbling to the ground. The playground fell silent as the giant bully found himself flat on his back, staring up in shock at the small girl who had put him there. "I said leave him alone," Maria repeated calmly, helping the younger boy gather his scattered belongings. Tommy got up, his face red with embarrassment and anger, and took a swing at Maria. But she was ready this time. She ducked under his punch, swept his legs, and put him on the ground again. This time, he stayed down. The incident made Maria something of a legend at her school, but she didn't enjoy the attention. She had acted not because she wanted to fight, but because someone needed protection and no one else was willing to provide it. This distinction would become important later in her life when she would face much more serious threats than a school bully. Her parents weren't sure how to react to their daughter's newfound reputation as someone not to mess with. Her mother worried that fighting would lead Maria down a dangerous path, while her father secretly felt proud that his little girl could take care of herself. Her grandfather, however, understood exactly what had happened. "You did the right thing, Mija," he told her that evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "But remember, fighting should always be the last choice, not the first. A real warrior protects others, but she also knows when to walk away." As Maria entered high school, her interest in the military grew stronger. She joined the ROTC program, where she quickly discovered that her small size could actually be an advantage in certain situations. While her male classmates struggled with endurance runs and obstacle courses that required agility over raw strength, Maria excelled. She could crawl through spaces they couldn't fit through, climb ropes faster than boys twice her size, and maintain her stamina during long training exercises, while others fell behind. Her ROTC instructor, Sergeant First Class David Martinez, recognized Maria's potential immediately. Martinez had served 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan and knew that the best soldiers weren't always the biggest or strongest ones. He had seen tiny medics carry wounded men twice their size to safety, and watched small-statured fighters outmaneuver much larger enemies through intelligence and determination. "Size is just one factor in combat," he told Maria during a one-on-one training session. "But heart, brain, and training can overcome almost any physical disadvantage. You've got something special, Santos. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Under Martinez's guidance, Maria threw herself into military training with an intensity that impressed even her toughest instructors. She studied combat medicine, learned advanced first aid techniques, and practiced battlefield scenarios until she could perform complex medical procedures while under simulated enemy fire. She memorized the layout of different types of military equipment, learned to strip and reassemble various weapons blindfolded, and developed the kind of situational awareness that would later save her life and the lives of others. But the real test of Maria's character came during her senior year of high school, when her older brother Carlos was deployed to Afghanistan with the 82nd Airborne Division. Carlos had always been protective of his little sister, often joking that she was too small and too gentle for the harsh realities of military life. When his convoy hit an improvised explosive device outside of Kandahar, leaving him with severe injuries and 2 of his friends dead, Maria saw firsthand what war could do to the people she loved. End of. She visited Carlos in the military hospital in San Antonio, where he lay connected to various machines, his left leg shattered and his spirit broken. The confident, joking older brother she had grown up with was gone, replaced by a quiet, haunted young man who stared at the ceiling and barely spoke to his visitors. "I couldn't save them, Maria," he whispered during one of her visits, tears streaming down his face. "Rodriguez and Martinez were right there next to me, and I couldn't do anything. They died because I wasn't fast enough, wasn't strong enough, wasn't good enough." Maria took her brother's hand and squeezed it gently. "You survived because you were meant to survive," she told him. "And Rodriguez and Martinez died because war is terrible and unfair, not because you failed them." "You don't understand," Carlos said, turning his head away from her. "You've never been in combat. You don't know what it's like to watch your friends die." His words stung, but they also strengthened Maria's resolve. She realized that her brother was right. She had never been in combat, and she couldn't truly understand what he had experienced. But she could learn. She could train. She could prepare herself to be the kind of soldier who could make a difference when it mattered most. That night, Maria made a decision that would change the course of her life. She was going to enlist in the army as a combat medic, and she was going to be so well trained and prepared that when her moment came, when soldiers needed her help, she would be ready to save them. Her parents tried to talk her out of it. Her mother cried and begged her to consider a safer career path, perhaps as a nurse in a civilian hospital. Her father worried that his tiny daughter would be overwhelmed by the physical demands of military service. Even Carlos, once he learned of her plans, tried to convince her that she was making a mistake. "You're too small, Maria," he said from his hospital bed. "The gear alone weighs more than half what you do. How are you going to carry a wounded soldier to safety? How are you going to survive in combat when guys twice your size are getting killed and wounded?" But Maria had made up her mind. And once a Santos made a decision, changing it was nearly impossible. She enlisted on her 18th birthday, choosing the military occupation specialty of 68W, Combat Medic. At the military entrance processing station in San Antonio, the recruiting sergeant looked at her paperwork and then at her small frame with obvious skepticism. "Are you sure about this, young lady?" he asked. "Combat Medic is one of the toughest jobs in the Army. You'll be expected to perform under fire, carry heavy equipment, and physically move wounded soldiers who might weigh twice what you do." "I'm sure," Maria replied without hesitation. The sergeant shrugged and processed her paperwork. He had seen plenty of recruits who thought they knew what they were getting into, only to wash out during basic training or advanced individual training. He figured this tiny girl from Texas would be gone within 6 months. He couldn't have been more wrong. Basic combat training at Fort Moore, Georgia, was everything Maria had expected, and more. The physical demands were intense, the mental pressure was constant, and the drill sergeant seemed to take particular pleasure in challenging the smallest members of the platoon. But Maria had been preparing for this moment for years, both physically and mentally. While other recruits struggled with the transition from civilian to military life, she thrived. The first major test came during the initial Army physical fitness test. Maria needed to complete a minimum number of push-ups, sit-ups, and finish a 2-mile run within specific time limits to continue with training. As she approached the push-up station, she could hear other recruits whispering bets about whether she would be able to complete even the minimum requirement. When the drill sergeant called "Begin," Maria dropped into position and started her push-ups. Her technique was perfect, her pace was steady, and her determination was absolute. While larger recruits struggled with their own body weight, Maria's compact frame and excellent conditioning allowed her to exceed the minimum requirement by a significant margin. She did the same with sit-ups, and when it came time for the 2-mile run, she not only finished within the time limit, but placed third in her entire company. The whispers stopped after that first PT test, but Maria knew she had only won the first battle in a much longer war. Over the following weeks, she would have to prove herself again and again, not just to the drill sergeants, but to her fellow recruits, who still saw her as a liability rather than an asset. The real challenge for Maria came during the field training exercises that made up the final phase of basic combat training. These exercises were designed to simulate real combat conditions, complete with live ammunition, simulated enemy attacks, and scenarios that required soldiers to think quickly under extreme pressure. For combat medics, these exercises included realistic casualty scenarios where they had to treat wounded soldiers while under simulated enemy fire. The exercise that would define Maria's reputation among her peers took place during the 8th week of training. The scenario involved a convoy ambush where multiple soldiers had been wounded and needed immediate medical attention while the unit was still taking enemy fire. Maria's squad was assigned to secure the area and evacuate the casualties, with Maria serving as the primary medic for the operation. As the exercise began, explosions simulated by drill sergeants echoed through the training area while soldiers playing enemy forces fired blank ammunition from concealed positions. The noise was overwhelming, the smoke from the explosions made it difficult to see, and the constant yelling of orders and requests for help created a chaotic environment that was designed to test every recruit's ability to function under stress. Maria's first casualty was Private Johnson, a 6-foot-tall soldier from Ohio who weighed more than twice what she did. Johnson was playing the role of a soldier with a severe leg wound and was instructed to remain motionless while Maria assessed and treated his injuries. The problem was that Johnson was located in an exposed position where Maria would be vulnerable to enemy fire while treating him. Without hesitation, Maria grabbed her medical kit and sprinted toward Johnson's position, zigzagging to avoid the simulated enemy fire that was being directed at her. When she reached Johnson, she immediately began her assessment while keeping her head down to avoid being killed by the opposing force instructors who were watching every move. "Where are you hit?" she asked Johnson, even though she could see the simulated wound markers that had been placed on his leg. "My leg," Johnson replied, playing his role convincingly. "I can't move it, and I'm losing a lot of blood." Maria quickly applied a tourniquet to Johnson's upper leg, bandaged the simulated wound, and prepared to move him to safety. This was the moment that everyone had been waiting for. How was a 110-pound girl going to move a 220-pound soldier to safety while under enemy fire? The answer surprised everyone. including the drill sergeants who were evaluating the exercise. Instead of trying to drag Johnson directly, which would have been impossible given the size difference, Maria used a technique she had learned from studying combat medic procedures used by Israeli Defense Forces medics, who often faced similar size disparities. She positioned Johnson so that she could use leverage and proper body mechanics to move him efficiently rather than relying on raw strength. First, she got Johnson into a sitting position and placed her shoulder under his arm, supporting his weight on her compact but strong frame. Then, she used a series of short movements, covering ground in manageable segments while maintaining Johnson's stability and protecting his injured leg. When the terrain required it, she employed a modified fireman's carry that distributed his weight across her body in a way that allowed her to maintain mobility. The entire evacuation took 12 minutes, during which Maria successfully moved Johnson more than 200 yards to the designated casualty collection point, while maintaining proper medical care and avoiding simulated enemy fire. By the time she had completed the evacuation, a crowd of drill sergeants, instructors, and fellow recruits had gathered to watch the tiny medic accomplish something that many of them hadn't thought was possible. "Outstanding work, Private Santos," said Drill Sergeant Williams, the senior instructor overseeing the exercise. "That was some of the best combat medical work I've seen from a recruit in 15 years of training soldiers." But Maria wasn't finished. While the other recruits were celebrating her successful evacuation of Johnson, she noticed that there were still 2 more casualties in the training area who hadn't received medical attention. Without waiting for orders, she grabbed her medical kit and headed back into the danger area to treat the remaining wounded soldiers. The second casualty was Private Rodriguez, who was simulating a chest wound and difficulty breathing. Maria quickly assessed his condition, provided appropriate treatment, and called for additional medical support over the radio using proper military communication protocols. The third casualty had a simulated head injury that required careful stabilization and monitoring. By the time the exercise was completed, Maria had successfully treated and evacuated 3 casualties, coordinated with supporting elements, and demonstrated a level of medical competence and tactical awareness that impressed even the most skeptical observers. More importantly, she had done all of this while maintaining her composure under pressure and making decisions that prioritized the welfare of her patients over her own safety. That night, as the recruits cleaned their equipment and discussed the day's training, Maria found herself at the center of attention in a way that made her slightly uncomfortable. Soldiers who had previously dismissed her as too small or too weak were now approaching her with a new level of respect and curiosity. "How did you learn to do that?" asked Private Thompson, one of the recruits who had been most vocal about his doubts regarding Maria's capabilities. "I mean, moving Johnson like that. I probably couldn't have done it, and I'm twice your size. It's not about being stronger than the person you're helping," Maria explained as she cleaned her rifle. "It's about understanding leverage, using proper technique, and being determined enough to find a way to get the job done. My grandfather taught me that size doesn't matter if you have the right knowledge and the will to use it." "Your grandfather was military?" asked another recruit. "World War II medic," Maria replied. "He always said that being a medic isn't about being the toughest person on the battlefield. It's about being the most determined to save lives, no matter what obstacles you face." The conversation continued for another hour, with Maria sharing some of the lessons her grandfather had taught her and the other recruits offering their own perspectives on military service and what it meant to be part of a team. For the first time since arriving at basic combat training, Maria felt like she was truly part of the group, rather than an outsider trying to prove herself. The remaining weeks of basic combat training passed quickly, with Maria consistently performing at the top of her class in both medical training and general military skills. She excelled at weapons training, demonstrating excellent marksmanship with both the M4 carbine and the M9 pistol. Her scores on written examinations were among the highest in her company, and her leadership potential was noted by multiple instructors. During the final week of training, Maria was selected to serve as the student company commander for the graduation ceremony, an honor typically reserved for recruits who had demonstrated exceptional military bearing, leadership ability, and overall performance. As she stood in front of her fellow recruits during the ceremony, wearing the leadership position insignia on her uniform, Maria reflected on how much had changed since that first day when everyone had doubted whether she belonged in the military. Her parents, grandfather, and even her brother Carlos attended the graduation ceremony. Carlos had recovered enough from his injuries to travel, And seeing his little sister graduate at the top of her class filled him with a mixture of pride and concern. He was proud of what she had accomplished, but he also knew that her real challenges lay ahead of her in advanced individual training and eventually in combat deployment. After the ceremony, as Maria posed for pictures with her family, her grandfather pulled her aside for a private conversation. "I'm proud of you, Mija," he said, his eyes bright with tears he was trying not to shed. "You've proven that the Santos family tradition of service is in good hands. But remember what I always told you about being a medic." "What's that, abuelo?" Maria asked. "The hardest part isn't the training or even the fighting," he said, placing his weathered hand on her shoulder. "The hardest part is living with the knowledge that no matter how good you are, no matter how hard you try, you can't save everyone. When that time comes, and it will come, remember that saving one life is worth all the lives you couldn't save." His words would prove to be prophetic, but at that moment Maria was focused on the next phase of her training. Advanced individual training for combat medics would take place at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, where she would spend 4 months learning advanced medical procedures, combat casualty care, and the specific skills she would need to function as a medic in a combat environment. The transition from basic combat training to advanced individual training was like moving from high school to college. The training was more specialized, the expectations were higher, and the margin for error was smaller. Combat medic training covered everything from advanced trauma care and battlefield surgery to the proper use of medical equipment and coordination with evacuation assets. Maria thrived in this environment. Her academic background, natural intelligence, and genuine passion for medical care made her an excellent student. She learned to perform complex medical procedures under simulated combat conditions, mastered the use of advanced medical equipment, and developed the kind of clinical judgment that would allow her to make life-or-death decisions in high-stress situations. One of her instructors, Staff Sergeant Jennifer Mitchell, was a combat veteran who had served as a medic during multiple deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. Mitchell recognized something special in Maria and took her under her wing, providing additional training and mentorship that went beyond the standard curriculum. "You have the potential to be an exceptional combat medic," Mitchell told Maria during a one-on-one training session. "But potential means nothing if you don't combine it with experience and wisdom. The medical procedures you're learning here will save lives, but understanding people and reading situations will determine whether you're in the right place at the right time to use those skills." Mitchell taught Maria advanced combat medical techniques that weren't part of the standard curriculum, including procedures for treating multiple casualties simultaneously, techniques for performing medical care in confined spaces, and methods for maintaining medical readiness during extended combat operations. More importantly, she taught Maria how to read the subtle signs that could indicate when a situation was about to become dangerous. "Combat medics don't just treat wounded soldiers," Mitchell explained. "They prevent soldiers from becoming casualties in the first place. A good medic watches everything, notices changes in people's behavior or health before they become serious problems, and positions herself where she can do the most good when things go wrong." Maria absorbed these lessons eagerly, understanding that they represented knowledge that couldn't be learned from textbooks or classroom instruction. Mitchell was sharing the kind of practical wisdom that could only come from years of experience in combat zones, and Maria was determined to make the most of the opportunity. As advanced individual training neared its end, Maria faced one final test that would determine not just whether she graduated, but what kind of assignment she would receive after graduation. The Comprehensive Medical Skills Assessment was a grueling 8-hour examination that combined written testing, practical medical procedures, and simulated combat scenarios. The practical portion of the examination required Maria to treat multiple casualties with various types of injuries while operating under simulated combat conditions. She had to demonstrate proficiency with all the medical equipment she had learned to use, make appropriate medical decisions under pressure, and coordinate with other medical personnel and supporting elements. Maria approached the examination with the same methodical preparation she had applied to every other challenge she had faced in the military. She spent hours reviewing medical procedures, practicing with equipment, until she could operate it blindfolded, and mentally rehearsing different scenarios she might encounter during the test. When the day of the examination arrived, Maria felt as ready as she could be. The test began with a written portion that covered medical theory, military medical procedures, and combat casualty care protocols. Maria completed this section quickly and confidently, drawing on months of intensive study and her natural aptitude for academic material. The practical portion of the examination was more challenging. Maria was presented with a series of casualties with different types of injuries, ranging from gunshot wounds and blast injuries to medical emergencies like heart attacks and severe allergic reactions. She had to assess each casualty, provide appropriate treatment, and make decisions about evacuation priorities while dealing with limited resources and simulated enemy activity. The final scenario of the examination was the most complex. Maria was presented with a mass casualty situation involving 6 wounded soldiers with various types of injuries. She had to quickly assess all 6 casualties, determine which ones needed immediate attention, coordinate treatment with other medical personnel, and manage the evacuation process while operating in a simulated combat environment. This was the type of scenario that separated good medics from exceptional ones. It required not just medical knowledge and technical skills, but also leadership ability, decision-making skills under pressure, and the ability to manage multiple competing priorities simultaneously. Maria approached the scenario systematically, using the triage procedures she had learned to quickly assess all 6 casualties and prioritize them based on the severity of their injuries and the likelihood of survival with treatment. She identified the 2 casualties who needed immediate attention to prevent death, the 3 who required urgent care but could wait briefly, and the 1 whose injuries were so severe that treatment would be unlikely to save his life. Working with simulated supporting personnel, Maria coordinated the treatment of the immediate and urgent casualties, while ensuring that the expectant casualty received appropriate pain management and comfort care. She managed the evacuation process, maintained communication with higher headquarters, and ensured that all casualties received appropriate documentation of their injuries and treatment. Maria graduated from advanced individual training with the highest scores in her class and received her assignment to the 1st Battalion 187th Infantry Regiment, part of the 101st Airborne Division. The Rakkasans, as they were known, had a proud history dating back to World War II and had served with distinction in every major American conflict since then. More importantly for Maria, they were scheduled to deploy to Afghanistan within 6 months of her arrival at Fort Campbell. Her first day with the unit was both exciting and intimidating. As she walked into the battalion aid station where she would be working, Maria was acutely aware that she was joining a group of experienced combat medics who had already deployed together and formed the tight bonds that develop between soldiers who have faced combat together. She was the new person, the untested rookie who would have to prove herself all over again. The senior medic in her company was Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, a veteran of 3 previous deployments who had earned a reputation as one of the best combat medics in the battalion. Rodriguez was initially skeptical of the tiny new medic who had been assigned to his team, but he was also fair enough to give her a chance to prove herself before making any judgments. "So you're the hotshot from AIT who thinks she's ready for combat," Rodriguez said when Maria reported to him on her first day. It wasn't a question, and his tone suggested that he had already heard about her performance and training. "I'm ready to learn from experienced soldiers like you, Sergeant," Maria replied respectfully. "I know there's a big difference between training and real combat, and I want to be as prepared as possible before we deploy." Rodriguez studied her for a moment, noting her professional demeanor and the confidence in her voice. "Fair enough, Santos. We've got 6 months to get you ready for Afghanistan, and I'm going to make sure you know everything you need to know to keep our soldiers alive over there. But understand this. In combat, there's no room for mistakes. The lives of your fellow soldiers depend on your ability to perform under pressure, and if you can't handle that responsibility, you need to find a different job." "I understand, Sergeant," Maria replied. "I won't let you or the unit down." The training that followed was the most intensive and realistic that Maria had ever experienced. Rodriguez and the other experienced medics in the unit had designed a training program based on their actual combat experiences, incorporating lessons learned from previous deployments and focusing on the specific medical challenges they were likely to face in Afghanistan. The training covered advanced trauma care procedures that went beyond what Maria had learned in AIT, including techniques for treating casualties in austere environments with limited resources. She learned how to perform emergency surgery in field conditions, how to manage complex medical evacuations from remote locations, and how to coordinate with aviation assets for casualty evacuation under fire. But the most valuable part of the training wasn't the technical medical procedures. It was the integration with the infantry soldiers she would be supporting in combat. Maria spent countless hours with the rifle squads and weapons teams, learning how they operated, understanding their tactics and procedures, and developing the trust and mutual respect that would be essential for effective operations in combat. During field training exercises, Maria had the opportunity to work with soldiers who had already experienced combat and understood the realities of what they would face in Afghanistan. These soldiers didn't care about her size or her gender. They cared about her ability to keep them alive if they were wounded, and they evaluated her based on her performance during realistic training scenarios. One exercise in particular helped establish Maria's credibility with the infantry soldiers. The scenario involved a patrol that had been ambushed in a remote valley, with multiple casualties and limited options for evacuation. Maria's squad was tasked with reaching the ambushed patrol, treating the casualties, and coordinating their evacuation while fighting off continued enemy attacks. The exercise took place in mountainous terrain similar to what they would encounter in Afghanistan, with realistic weather conditions and the physical challenges of operating at high altitude. Maria had to carry her full combat load, including medical equipment, while moving over difficult terrain and maintaining the pace set by the infantry soldiers she was supporting. When they reached the simulated ambush site, Maria found herself facing a complex medical scenario with 4 casualties of varying severity. The first casualty had a sucking chest wound that required immediate attention to prevent death. The second had suffered severe trauma to both legs and was going into shock. The third had a head injury that had left him unconscious and unresponsive. The fourth had multiple fragment wounds that were bleeding heavily but weren't immediately life-threatening. Working under simulated enemy fire with the constant noise of blank ammunition and simulated explosions, Maria had to quickly assess all 4 casualties, prioritize their treatment, and coordinate with the infantry soldiers to establish security while she worked. The stress was intense, the time pressure was overwhelming, and the physical demands of working in full combat gear in mountainous terrain pushed her to her limits. But Maria performed flawlessly. She stabilized the chest wound casualty, controlled the bleeding on the leg trauma patient, properly immobilized the head injury victim, and provided appropriate treatment for the multiple fragment wounds. She coordinated with the squad leader to call for medical evacuation, provided detailed information about each casualty's condition and treatment requirements, and helped establish a suitable landing zone for the evacuation helicopter. The entire scenario took nearly 4 hours to complete, during which Maria demonstrated not only her medical competence, but also her ability to function effectively as part of a combat team. When the exercise was over, the infantry soldiers who had initially been skeptical of their tiny new medic were expressing genuine confidence in her abilities. "I've got to admit, Santos," said Sergeant First Class David Martinez, one of the squad leaders who had participated in the exercise. "I wasn't sure about you when you first got here, but after watching you work today, I'd be happy to have you as my medic on any mission. You know your stuff, and you don't panic under pressure." Similar comments came from other soldiers throughout the unit, and Maria began to feel like she was truly becoming part of the team, rather than an outsider trying to prove herself. The integration process was helped by the fact that Maria genuinely enjoyed spending time with the infantry soldiers, and was interested in learning about their jobs and their experiences. She volunteered for additional training opportunities, including airborne training to earn her paratrooper wings and air assault training that would qualify her to conduct helicopter insertion missions. She also spent time at the firing range, honing her marksmanship skills and familiarizing herself with all the weapon systems used by the unit. As the deployment date approached, Maria felt as ready as she could be for combat. She had trained extensively with her unit, developed strong relationships with the soldiers she would be supporting, and achieved a level of medical competence that had earned the respect of experienced combat veterans. But she also understood that no amount of training could fully prepare her for the realities of actual combat. The deployment to Afghanistan began with a long flight from Kentucky to Germany, then from Germany to Kyrgyzstan, and finally from Kyrgyzstan to Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan. Maria had never been outside the United States before, and the cultural shock of arriving in a war zone was overwhelming. Everything was different. The landscape, the climate, the sounds and smells, and the constant awareness that they were in a place where people were actively trying to kill them. Bagram Airfield was a massive military installation that served as the main hub for American and NATO forces in Afghanistan. The base included everything from fast food restaurants and coffee shops to ammunition depots and aircraft maintenance facilities. For Maria, it was both fascinating and slightly surreal to see this slice of American military life transplanted into the mountains of Afghanistan. After a week of in-processing and additional briefings about the specific threats and challenges they would face during their deployment, Maria's unit was assigned to Forward Operating Base Shank in Logar Province. FOB Shank was a much smaller and more austere installation than Bagram, located in a valley surrounded by mountains that provided excellent concealment for enemy forces. The base itself was a collection of concrete barriers, temporary buildings, and defensive positions designed to protect the soldiers stationed there from rocket attacks, mortar fire, and ground assaults. Maria's living quarters consisted of a small room in a containerized housing unit that she shared with another female soldier, with barely enough space for 2 bunks and their personal belongings. The medical facilities at FOB Shank were basic but functional, with an aid station that could handle routine medical problems and stabilize serious casualties until they could be evacuated to larger medical facilities. Maria quickly familiarized herself with the equipment and procedures used at the aid station and began treating soldiers for the variety of medical problems that were common in a combat environment. Most of her work during the first few weeks of deployment was routine, treating soldiers for minor injuries, illnesses, and the various health problems that resulted from living in a harsh environment with limited amenities. She treated everything from sprained ankles and upset stomachs to more serious conditions like heat injuries and infections that developed from small cuts that hadn't healed properly in the dusty, unsanitary conditions. But Maria knew that routine medical care was only part of her job. Combat medics in Afghanistan spent much of their time conducting patrols with infantry units, providing medical support for operations in remote areas where casualties couldn't be quickly evacuated to medical facilities. These missions were the real test of a combat medic's abilities, and Maria was eager to prove herself in actual combat conditions. Her first combat patrol took place 3 weeks after arriving at FOB Shank. The mission was a relatively routine presence patrol, designed to interact with local Afghan civilians and gather intelligence about enemy activity in the area. Maria was assigned to support a squad of infantry soldiers, led by Sergeant First Class Martinez, the same NCO who had initially been skeptical of her abilities, but had come to respect her competence during training. The patrol began before dawn, with 12 soldiers moving on foot through a series of small villages in the valleys surrounding FOB Shank. Maria carried her standard combat load of ammunition, water, and survival equipment, plus an additional 30 pounds of medical supplies that might be needed if someone was wounded during the patrol. The terrain was challenging, with steep hills, rocky paths, and irrigation ditches that had to be carefully negotiated while maintaining security and staying alert for signs of enemy activity. The weather was hot and dusty, with temperatures reaching over 100 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-morning. For the first few hours, the patrol proceeded without incident. They visited several villages, spoke with local residents through an interpreter, and conducted searches of buildings that had been identified as potential enemy staging areas. Maria stayed with the patrol's command element, maintaining communication with the base, and monitoring the health and condition of the soldiers under her care. The attack came without warning, as they were moving through a narrow valley between 2 ridgelines. The first indication of trouble was the distinctive crack of a sniper's rifle, followed immediately by the metallic ping of a bullet striking rocks near Maria's position. Within seconds, the entire valley erupted in gunfire as enemy fighters opened fire from concealed positions on both sides of the patrol route. "Contact left! Contact right!" screamed Martinez, as soldiers dove for cover behind rocks and in irrigation ditches. "Santos, we've got a man down." Maria looked in the direction Martinez was pointing and saw Private Johnson, one of the soldiers she had evacuated during training exercises, lying motionless about 50 meters away in an exposed position. Blood was visible on his uniform, and he wasn't moving or responding to the calls of his fellow soldiers. The gunfire was intense, with bullets striking the ground around Maria's position and ricocheting off the rocks she was using for cover. The sound was overwhelming. The sharp crack of incoming rounds, the deeper boom of friendly weapons returning fire, and the constant shouting of soldiers calling out target locations and ammunition status. Maria knew that Johnson needed immediate medical attention, but reaching him would require crossing 50 meters of open ground while under direct enemy fire. It was exactly the kind of scenario she had trained for, but the difference between training and reality was stark. In training, the bullets were blanks and the blood was fake. Here, people were really trying to kill her, and Johnson's life depended on her ability to reach him and provide treatment. Without hesitation, Maria gathered her medical equipment and prepared to move toward Johnson's position. Martinez grabbed her arm as she started to leave cover. "Santos, it's too dangerous," he shouted over the noise of gunfire. "They've got that position covered. You'll be killed before you can reach him." Maria looked at Martinez with the same expression she had worn when facing the school bully years earlier. "He's my responsibility, Sergeant. I'm not leaving him there." Before Martinez could stop her, Maria sprinted from cover toward Johnson's position, zigzagging to avoid the enemy fire that immediately focused on her small, fast-moving figure. Bullets kicked up dirt around her feet and whined past her head, but her training had taught her to ignore distractions and focus on the mission. She reached Johnson in less than 30 seconds and immediately began her medical assessment while staying as low as possible to avoid enemy fire. Johnson had been shot in the upper chest, and the bullet had apparently struck his body armor and deflected into his shoulder. He was conscious, but in severe pain and losing blood from the shoulder wound. "Johnson, can you hear me?" Maria asked as she cut away his uniform to access the wound. "Yeah, Doc," Johnson replied weakly. "Am I going to be okay?" "You're going to be fine," Maria told him as she applied pressure to control the bleeding. "The bullet hit your armor and deflected. You've got a shoulder wound, but nothing that's going to kill you." Working quickly, Maria applied a pressure dressing to Johnson's shoulder wound and prepared to move him to a safer position where she could provide more comprehensive treatment. The enemy fire was still intense, and she knew that staying in the exposed position would put both of them at greater risk. The successful evacuation of Johnson during that first firefight established Maria's reputation as a combat medic who could be counted on under fire. But it was just the beginning of what would prove to be an eventful deployment. Over the following months, she participated in dozens of patrols and operations, treating everything from combat wounds and blast injuries to heat casualties and the various medical problems that plagued soldiers operating in austere conditions. Each mission taught her something new about combat medicine and about herself. She learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when a soldier was developing heat stroke before it became life-threatening. She mastered the art of providing medical care while wearing full combat equipment in confined spaces like armored vehicles and bunkers. Most importantly, she developed the kind of situational awareness that allowed her to anticipate problems before they became emergencies. Her reputation within the unit continued to grow as soldiers who had initially been skeptical of their tiny medic came to realize that she was as competent and reliable as any medic they had served with. She was no longer the new girl trying to prove herself, but simply Doc Santos, the medic you wanted with you when things went wrong. The respect she had earned was put to the test during a mission in October, 6 months into the deployment. Intelligence reports had indicated that a high-value target, a Taliban commander responsible for several recent attacks on coalition forces, was operating from a compound in a remote valley about 20 kilometers from FOB Shank. Maria's unit was tasked with conducting a night raid to capture or kill the target and gather intelligence about his network. The mission began at 2300 hours with a helicopter insertion into a landing zone several kilometers from the target compound. Maria was part of a 30-soldier assault force that included infantry, special operations elements, and supporting personnel. The plan called for a coordinated assault on the compound, with multiple elements approaching from different directions to prevent the target from escaping. Maria's role in the mission was to provide medical support for the assault force and to treat any casualties that might result from the operation. She carried a lighter combat load than usual to allow for additional medical supplies, but she was still armed and prepared to fight if necessary. The helicopter flight to the insertion point was tense but uneventful. Maria sat in the darkness of the aircraft cabin, reviewing her medical procedures and mentally preparing for what might await them at the target compound. The soldiers around her were quiet and focused, each lost in his own thoughts about the mission ahead. The landing zone was a small clearing surrounded by rocky hills and sparse vegetation. As the helicopters touched down, Maria and the other soldiers quickly exited and moved to their assigned positions while the aircraft departed into the darkness. Within minutes, they were alone in enemy territory with nothing but their training, their equipment, and their trust in each other to keep them alive. The approach to the target compound took nearly 2 hours, with the assault force moving carefully through difficult terrain while maintaining noise and light discipline. Maria stayed with the command element, monitoring radio communications and staying alert for any signs that soldiers in the assault force were developing medical problems during the movement. As they neared the compound, the assault force split into multiple elements that would approach the target from different directions. Maria was assigned to the main assault element that would breach the compound's front entrance and clear the primary buildings where the target was believed to be located. The compound consisted of several single-story buildings surrounded by a high wall with a main gate and several smaller entrances. Intelligence reports suggested that the target kept a small security force, but the exact number and disposition of enemy fighters was unknown. The assault began at 0330 hours with the simultaneous detonation of explosive charges at multiple points around the compound perimeter. Maria followed the lead assault team through the breached wall, staying close enough to provide immediate medical support, but far enough back to avoid being caught in the initial exchange of gunfire. The compound was darker than expected, with most of the buildings showing no lights or signs of activity. For a moment, Maria wondered if the intelligence had been wrong and the target wasn't actually present. That question was answered when the lead element approached the main building and came under intense automatic weapons fire from multiple positions. The firefight that followed was unlike anything Maria had experienced during her previous combat operations. The enemy fighters were well-trained and well-equipped, fighting from prepared positions with overlapping fields of fire that made it difficult for the assault force to advance. The volume of fire was incredible, with bullets striking walls and kicking up dust clouds that made it difficult to see more than a few meters in any direction. Maria's first casualty was Specialist Williams, a machine gunner who had been shot in the leg while trying to establish a support by fire position. Williams was in an exposed location where enemy fire made it dangerous for anyone to attempt a rescue, but Maria knew that without immediate medical attention he would likely bleed to death from his wound. Moving under fire had become second nature to Maria during her months in Afghanistan, but this firefight was more intense than anything she had previously experienced. As she moved toward Williams' position, she could hear bullets whining past her head and striking the ground around her feet. The enemy fighters had apparently identified her as a medic and were specifically targeting her to prevent her from treating wounded soldiers. She reached Williams and quickly assessed his wound while using his machine gun position for cover from enemy fire. The bullet had struck him in the upper thigh, missing the femoral artery but causing significant tissue damage and bleeding. Williams was conscious but in severe pain and beginning to show signs of shock. "Doc, I can't feel my leg," Williams said as Maria worked to control the bleeding. "That's normal with this type of wound," Maria replied while applying a tourniquet. "The important thing is that you're going to be okay. The bullet missed all the vital structures, so this is painful but not life-threatening." As she stabilized Williams' wound, Maria became aware that the intensity of enemy fire around their position was increasing. Looking up from her patient, she saw muzzle flashes from multiple positions around the compound and realized that the assault force was facing a much larger enemy force than had been anticipated. The radio chatter she could hear through her headset confirmed her assessment. Multiple elements of the assault force were reporting contact with enemy fighters, casualties were mounting, and the mission commander was calling for additional support. What had been planned as a quick raid to capture or kill a single target had turned into a sustained firefight against a well-prepared enemy force. After stabilizing Williams, Maria coordinated with other soldiers to move him to a safer position where she could provide more comprehensive treatment and where he would be ready for evacuation when it became available. But even as she worked on Williams, she could see other soldiers in the assault force who had been wounded and needed medical attention. Her next casualty was Lieutenant Thompson, the platoon leader who had been shot in the abdomen while directing his soldiers' assault on one of the compound buildings. Thompson's wound was more serious than Williams, with significant internal bleeding that required immediate surgical intervention to prevent death. Thompson was located in a courtyard in the center of the compound where enemy fire from multiple directions made it extremely dangerous to attempt treatment. Maria knew that reaching him would require crossing nearly 100 meters of open ground under direct observation and fire from enemy positions. But she also knew that Thompson would die without immediate medical intervention, and that his soldiers needed their leader to continue functioning effectively in the firefight. Without hesitation, she gathered her medical equipment and began moving toward Thompson's position. The movement across the courtyard was the longest and most terrifying of Maria's life. Enemy fighters from multiple positions focused their fire on her small figure as she sprinted, crawled, and rolled across the open ground. Bullets struck the ground inches from her body, ricocheted off walls near her head, and tore through her equipment and clothing. Somehow, she reached Thompson without being hit and immediately began her medical assessment. The lieutenant had been shot in the lower abdomen, with the bullet apparently striking his intestines and causing significant internal bleeding. He was conscious but pale and showing classic signs of shock from blood loss. "Thompson, I need you to stay with me," Maria said as she cut away his uniform to access the wound. "You've been shot in the abdomen, but I'm going to get you stabilized and ready for evacuation." "How bad is it, Doc?" Thompson asked weakly. "It's serious, but you're going to make it," Maria replied as she worked to control the external bleeding and prepare Thompson for transport. "I need you to stay conscious and keep talking to me." While treating Thompson, Maria noticed that the volume of enemy fire around their position was decreasing. Looking around the compound, she could see that the assault force had gained the upper hand in the firefight and was beginning to clear the remaining buildings. But she also noticed something that made her blood run cold. Movement in the shadows near one of the compound buildings suggested that enemy fighters were attempting to maneuver into positions where they could attack the wounded soldiers and the medics treating them. Maria realized that she and her casualties were about to become the targets of a coordinated enemy counterattack. The attack came just as Maria was preparing to move Thompson to a safer location. Enemy fighters emerged from concealment in multiple locations around the compound, firing automatic weapons and throwing grenades at the positions where wounded soldiers were receiving medical treatment. The intent was clear: kill the wounded and the medics caring for them to demoralize the assault force and force them to withdraw. Maria found herself in the middle of what would later be described as the most intense close-quarters combat of the entire Afghan war. Enemy fighters were literally within arm's reach, firing at her and the soldiers she was treating while she attempted to provide medical care and coordinate the defense of her casualties. The firefight that followed tested every aspect of Maria's training and character. She had to simultaneously provide life-saving medical treatment to seriously wounded soldiers while engaging enemy fighters with her weapon, and coordinating with other soldiers to establish a defensive perimeter around the casualty collection point. At one point, an enemy fighter armed with an AK-47 rifle rounded a corner and found himself face-to-face with Maria as she knelt beside Thompson providing medical treatment. The fighter raised his weapon to shoot, but Maria was faster. She drew her sidearm and fired 3 rapid shots, hitting the fighter's center mass and dropping him before he could fire a shot. Without missing a beat, she holstered her weapon and returned to treating Thompson, her hands steady and her voice calm as she continued to provide medical care while the firefight raged around them. It was a moment that perfectly encapsulated everything Maria had learned about being a combat medic. Her primary mission was to save lives, but she would kill without hesitation to protect her patients and her fellow soldiers. The enemy counterattack was eventually repelled, but not before several more soldiers had been wounded, and Maria had treated a total of 7 casualties under fire. By the time reinforcements arrived and the compound was fully secured, Maria had been continuously engaged in combat operations for nearly 6 hours, moving between wounded soldiers, treating life-threatening injuries, and fighting off enemy attacks. When the mission was over and the casualties had been evacuated, Maria found herself sitting in the back of a transport helicopter, covered in blood and dust, trying to process what had just happened. She had saved the lives of 7 soldiers, killed at least 3 enemy fighters, and demonstrated a level of courage and competence under fire that would earn her the Silver Star and the respect of every soldier who had witnessed her performance. But the mission that would make Maria a legend was still ahead of her. 2 weeks later, during a routine medical resupply mission to a remote outpost, she would face a situation that would test everything she had learned about combat, medicine, and what it meant to be a soldier. The mission that would define Maria Santos's legacy began as a routine medical resupply run to Combat Outpost Keating, a small American position located in a valley in Nuristan province. The outpost was home to 53 soldiers from Bravo Troop, 3rd Squadron, 61st Cavalry Regiment, and had been established to interdict Taliban supply routes and provide security for the local population. Maria was part of a 6-person medical team that was scheduled to deliver medical supplies, conduct routine health assessments of the soldiers stationed at the outpost, and provide any necessary medical treatment for soldiers who couldn't be evacuated to larger medical facilities. It was the kind of mission she had performed dozens of times during her deployment, and there was no reason to expect that this one would be any different. The helicopter flight to Cop Keating took place on a clear November morning, with excellent visibility and no indication of enemy activity in the area. Maria sat in the cargo compartment of the UH-60 Blackhawk helicopter, reviewing the medical records of soldiers stationed at the outpost and mentally preparing for the routine medical care she expected to provide during the two-day visit. The outpost itself was located at the bottom of a steep-sided valley, surrounded on all sides by mountains that rose more than 1,000 feet above the position. It was a tactically disadvantageous location that made the outpost vulnerable to enemy observation and fire. But it had been chosen because it provided access to the main road that Taliban forces used to move supplies and fighters through the region. As the helicopter approached the landing zone, Maria could see the soldiers at the outpost preparing for their arrival. The landing zone was a small clearing just outside the perimeter of the outpost, surrounded by defensive positions and protective barriers that had been constructed to provide some protection from enemy fire during helicopter operations. The helicopter touched down smoothly, and Maria and the other members of the medical team quickly unloaded their equipment and supplies while the aircraft's engines continued to run. The plan called for the helicopter to remain on the ground for only a few minutes before departing, leaving the medical team at the outpost until a scheduled pickup flight 2 days later. As Maria gathered her medical equipment and prepared to move toward the outpost, she noticed something that triggered her situational awareness training. The soldiers who had come to meet the helicopter seemed unusually tense and alert, constantly scanning the ridgelines around the valley and moving with the kind of urgency that suggested they expected trouble. Something wrong? Maria asked Staff Sergeant David Chen, the senior medic at the outpost who had come to escort them inside the perimeter. "We've been getting reports of increased enemy activity in the area over the past few days," Chen replied as they moved toward the outpost. "Intelligence thinks the Taliban might be planning something big, but we don't know what or when." As they entered the outpost perimeter, Maria was struck by the isolated and vulnerable nature of the position. The outpost consisted of a collection of small buildings, defensive positions, and living quarters that had been constructed in the bottom of the valley, surrounded by mountains that provided perfect concealment and firing positions for enemy forces. The soldiers stationed at Cop Keating were experienced and professional, but Maria could sense the tension that came from operating in such a tactically disadvantageous position. They knew they were vulnerable, and they knew that if the Taliban decided to attack in force, holding the position would be extremely difficult. Maria spent the first day of her visit conducting routine medical examinations and treating minor injuries and illnesses. The work was similar to what she had done at dozens of other outposts during her deployment, and she found herself settling into the familiar routine of providing health care in a combat environment. That evening, as she was preparing her equipment for the next day's medical activities, Maria was approached by Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Bradley, the commander of the outpost. Bradley was a veteran officer who had served multiple combat tours, and Maria could tell from his demeanor that he had something important to discuss with her. "Doc Santos, I need to talk to you about something," Bradley said, leading her to a quiet area where they could speak privately. "We've been monitoring enemy communications, and it looks like the Taliban are planning a major attack on this position, probably sometime in the next 24 hours. Maria felt a chill run down her spine as she processed this information. A major Taliban attack on such a small and isolated position would likely result in significant casualties, and she was the senior medic on site with responsibility for treating wounded soldiers during what could be an intense and prolonged firefight. "What kind of attack are we talking about, sir?" Maria asked. "Intelligence suggests they're planning a coordinated assault with at least 200 fighters," Bradley replied grimly. "They want to overrun this position and kill or capture every American soldier here. It's going to be a fight for survival." Bradley went on to explain that reinforcements were being organized, but it would take time for them to reach the isolated outpost. In the meantime, the 53 soldiers at Cop Keating would have to hold their position against overwhelming odds while waiting for help to arrive. "I need you to be ready for mass casualties," Bradley told Maria. "This isn't going to be a few wounded soldiers. We're looking at the possibility of dozens of casualties, many of them serious. Can you handle that kind of situation?" Maria thought about everything she had learned during her training and her months in combat. She thought about her grandfather's stories about treating wounded soldiers during World War II, about the lessons she had learned from experienced medics, and about the soldiers who would be depending on her ability to keep them alive during what could be the most intense combat of the entire war. "I'll be ready, sir," she said simply. The attack began at 060 hours the next morning with a massive barrage of rocket-propelled grenades, mortars, and small arms fire that struck the outpost from multiple directions simultaneously. Maria was awakened by the sound of explosions and immediately knew that the anticipated attack had begun. Within minutes, the small outpost was surrounded by enemy fighters who had moved into positions on the ridgelines and hills surrounding the valley. The volume of incoming fire was unlike anything Maria had experienced, with hundreds of enemy fighters shooting down into the outpost from positions that provided them with excellent observation and fields of fire. The first casualties began arriving at Maria's aid station within minutes of the start of the attack. Soldiers who had been wounded by the initial barrage were carried in by their comrades, many of them suffering from serious injuries caused by explosive fragments and rifle fire. Maria's first patient was Private Rodriguez, a 19-year-old soldier from California who had been struck in the chest by shrapnel from a rocket-propelled grenade. The fragments had penetrated his body armor and caused significant damage to his lung, leaving him struggling to breathe and coughing up blood. Working quickly, Maria assessed Rodriguez's injuries and determined that he had a collapsed lung that required immediate treatment to prevent death. Using procedures she had learned during advanced training, she performed a needle thoracostomy to relieve the pressure in Rodriguez's chest cavity and allow his lung to reinflate. "Am I going to die, Doc?" Rodriguez asked weakly as Maria worked to stabilize his condition. "Not if I have anything to say about it," Maria replied, monitoring his vital signs and preparing him for evacuation. "You're going to be fine, but I need you to stay conscious and keep talking to me." Even as she treated Rodriguez, Maria could see other wounded soldiers being brought into the aid station. The intensity of the enemy attack was creating casualties faster than she could treat them, and she quickly realized that she was facing the kind of mass casualty situation that every combat medic trains for but hopes never to encounter. Her next patient was Sergeant Williams, a squad leader who had been shot in the abdomen while directing his soldiers' defensive efforts. Williams was conscious but showing signs of internal bleeding that would require surgical intervention to prevent death. Maria stabilized his condition as best she could with the resources available at the small aid station, knowing that he would need to be evacuated to a larger medical facility for definitive treatment. As the morning progressed, the stream of casualties continued to arrive at Maria's aid station. Soldiers with gunshot wounds, blast injuries, burns, and fractures were carried in by their comrades, while the firefight continued to rage around the outpost. Maria found herself treating multiple patients simultaneously, prioritizing care based on the severity of injuries and the likelihood of survival with treatment. The situation became even more challenging when enemy fire began impacting the aid station itself. Bullets struck the walls of the building where Maria was treating patients, and several rocket-propelled grenades exploded nearby, causing additional casualties among the soldiers she was already treating. At one point, a mortar round exploded directly outside the aid station, blowing out windows and filling the building with dust and debris. Maria was thrown to the ground by the blast, but she immediately got back up and continued treating her patients, ignoring the blood that was flowing from cuts on her face and arms. "Doc, you're hurt!" called out one of the wounded soldiers she was treating. "I'm fine," Maria replied, wiping blood from her eyes and returning to work. "Let me worry about taking care of you guys." As the battle entered its fourth hour, Maria realized that she was facing a situation that was beyond the capacity of any single medic to handle. She had 17 wounded soldiers in various stages of treatment, limited medical supplies, and no immediate prospect for evacuation due to the intense enemy fire that was preventing helicopters from landing at the outpost. The turning point came when Maria noticed movement outside the aid station that suggested enemy fighters were attempting to infiltrate the outpost perimeter. Looking through a window, she could see several Taliban fighters moving between buildings, apparently trying to reach positions where they could attack the aid station and kill the wounded soldiers inside. Maria knew that if enemy fighters reached the aid station, they would likely execute every wounded soldier she was treating. The thought of losing her patients to enemy action after working so hard to save their lives was unacceptable to her, and she made a decision that would define the rest of her military career. Grabbing her rifle and telling the wounded soldiers to stay down and take cover, Maria moved to the entrance of the aid station and prepared to defend her patients. She could see at least 9 enemy fighters moving toward the building, armed with automatic weapons and hand grenades. The firefight that followed was the most intense combat of Maria's deployment. Enemy fighters approached the aid station from multiple directions, firing automatic weapons and throwing grenades while Maria moved between defensive positions, returning fire and coordinating the defense of her wounded patients. The first enemy fighter to reach the aid station appeared at a window on the east side of the building, pointing his AK-47 rifle at the wounded soldiers inside. Maria saw him before he could fire and engaged him with her M4 carbine, hitting him with multiple shots and dropping him before he could harm any of her patients. The second and third fighters approached the main entrance of the building, apparently planning to assault through the doorway and kill everyone inside. Maria positioned herself where she could cover the entrance and engaged both fighters as they attempted to enter the building. The firefight was at extremely close range, with Maria firing from a prone position while the enemy fighters shot at her from just a few meters away. Maria's training and marksmanship skills proved superior to those of her attackers. She killed both fighters with accurate rifle fire while avoiding their return shots, but she knew that more enemy fighters were approaching the building and that she was running low on ammunition. The fourth and fifth fighters attempted to approach the aid station from the rear, apparently hoping to catch Maria by surprise while she was focused on the front of the building. But Maria's situational awareness training allowed her to detect their movement, and she repositioned herself to engage them as they tried to enter through a rear window. This engagement was more challenging because Maria had to move between wounded soldiers while fighting, ensuring that she didn't accidentally harm any of her patients while engaging the enemy fighters. She managed to kill both attackers with precise rifle fire, but not before one of them had thrown a hand grenade into the building. The grenade exploded near Maria's position, filling the aid station with smoke and debris and wounding several of the soldiers she was treating. Maria was knocked down by the blast and temporarily deafened, but she immediately got back up and resumed fighting while checking on her patients to ensure that none of them had been seriously injured by the explosion. The 6th, 7th, and 8th enemy fighters approached the aid station as a coordinated team, apparently having learned from the fate of their predecessors. They used cover and concealment effectively and coordinated their movements to make it difficult for Maria to engage all of them simultaneously. This phase of the fight required Maria to use every aspect of her combat training. She moved between defensive positions inside the aid station, using the building's layout to her advantage, while engaging multiple enemy fighters who were attempting to kill her and her patients. The firefight was conducted at ranges of less than 20 meters, with automatic weapons fire, grenades, and the constant danger of being overwhelmed by superior numbers. Maria killed the 6th fighter with accurate rifle fire as he attempted to enter through a side door. The 7th fighter was eliminated when he tried to climb through a window and exposed himself to Maria's fire. The 8th fighter proved more difficult, taking cover behind a concrete barrier outside the building and engaging Maria in a prolonged firefight that lasted several minutes. During this engagement, Maria ran out of ammunition for her rifle and had to transition to her sidearm while the enemy fighter continued to fire at her position with an automatic weapon. The situation was desperate, with Maria armed only with a pistol while facing an enemy fighter with superior firepower and protective cover. But Maria's training had prepared her for exactly this type of situation. Instead of trying to outgun her opponent, she used movement and deception to gain a tactical advantage. She created a distraction by throwing a piece of medical equipment in one direction while moving to a different position where she could get a clear shot at the enemy fighter. When the fighter turned to investigate the noise, Maria engaged him with her sidearm, firing multiple shots that struck him in the head and chest and ended the threat. But even as she eliminated the 8th attacker, she could see the 9th and final enemy fighter moving toward the aid station. This last fighter was apparently more experienced and tactically proficient than his predecessors. Instead of approaching the building directly, he positioned himself where he could observe the aid station and wait for an opportunity to attack when Maria was distracted or vulnerable. The standoff that followed was a test of patience, tactical awareness, and mental fortitude. Maria knew that the enemy fighter was out there somewhere, waiting for an opportunity to kill her and her patients. But she also knew that she couldn't abandon her defensive position to search for him, because that would leave her wounded soldiers vulnerable to attack. For nearly 30 minutes, Maria maintained her defensive position while treating wounded soldiers and watching for signs of the final enemy fighter. She used every technique she had learned about observation and surveillance, scanning the area around the aid station for any indication of enemy movement or activity. The final confrontation came when the enemy fighter attempted to approach the aid station during a lull in the broader battle taking place around the outpost. Maria detected his movement through a reflection in a piece of broken glass and immediately engaged him with her sidearm as he tried to reach a position where he could throw a grenade into the building. The final exchange of gunfire lasted less than 10 seconds. Maria's superior training, marksmanship, and tactical awareness allowed her to eliminate the last enemy fighter before he could harm any of her patients. When it was over, 9 enemy fighters lay dead around the aid station, while all 17 of Maria's wounded patients were still alive and receiving the medical care they needed to survive. The battle for COP Keating continued for several more hours, but the attack on the aid station was over. Maria had successfully defended her patients against overwhelming odds, killing 9 enemy fighters while providing life-saving medical treatment to 17 wounded soldiers. Her actions during that morning would earn her the Silver Star and establish her as one of the most decorated female soldiers in American military history. When reinforcements finally arrived and the Taliban attack was repelled, Maria was found at her aid station, still treating wounded soldiers and coordinating their evacuation. She was covered in blood, dust, and debris from the battle, but she was still focused on her mission of saving lives and caring for her fellow soldiers. The story of Maria Santos, the tiny medic who was called too weak for combat, had become legend. She had proven that true strength comes not from physical size or raw power, but from courage, determination, and an unwavering commitment to protecting those who depend on you. In the years that followed, Maria's story would be told in military training schools, written about in books and articles, and remembered by the soldiers whose lives she had saved. She had demonstrated that heroes come in all sizes, and that sometimes the most unlikely people are capable of the most extraordinary acts of courage. The woman they called too weak had become the warrior who proved that strength is measured not in pounds or inches, but in the size of one's heart and the depth of one's commitment to others. Maria Santos had saved 17 lives that day, but her true legacy was the example she set for future generations of soldiers who would face their own moments of truth in the crucible of combat.